Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity always to be at this conference and hear about all the really interesting work people are doing with important implications for disability and retirement policy, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this very interesting and ambitious paper. So just a quick overview, Amal explained this very well. The goal of this paper is to use the unique data set that they have to characterize trajectories of work and disability and then see how those correlate with demographic and job characteristics. I think it's safe to say they're just beginning to plumb the depths of this very rich data source. The project's still underway, and in fact, some of the results that I have have been slightly updated in terms of what you've seen today. But roughly speaking, about 2/3 of people follow a regular work pattern without disability, and among the remaining third, about 22% are following have just sort of a single episode of short-term disability or leave of absence, and something like 11, or today we heard 8% of people have a more disruptive work pattern with multiple episodes of disability on the job. And then we've heard about some of the characteristics such as gender and job characteristics that are associated with with a higher probability of this disruptive work patterns. So I think what's exciting here is the idea that we can look at these important relationships between health and disability and work in a frame of time that's before the exit from work. So we know that there's been a lot of research trying to understand how health affects retirement decisions, also how health affects DI, that is, to what extent the take-up of DI benefits is related to health versus other factors. There were some interesting papers yesterday about some of those other factors like the economy or the availability of opioids. So we're very interested in all these relationships, but most of the work tends to focus right on the moment of transition into retirement or into DI, and then kind of looking at what's happening kind of right around that time. So the idea of really widening the frame and looking back over the whole career at the relationships between health and disability and work, to me, was very exciting. And they have a really unique, and I was jealous of this data set that they're able to use to look at this, because it has very rich data. As we know, it's become more and more common for people to use administrative data to look at some of the kinds of questions that'll be discussed here over the next day and a half. Social Security earnings data are a very rich, important source of data for some of this research. Medicare claims data are very helpful for some of this work, but rarely do you have this kind of detailed information on both the employment and the health of working age people. So I think it's very exciting what one can do when one has this type of data. Usually administrative data is longitudinal, but what's useful in this context is that they can distinguish whether people are having single or multiple episodes of disability, and they can also really get into the sequencing of these events. When did the health go bad, and when did that show up in kind of these other outcomes? So I think it's very exciting. I want to make raise some questions and make some suggestions. Some of these, I think, are things that they're probably actually already in process or planning to do, but try to frame it as well in terms of the broader policy relevance here. So the first is almost an existential question. What is short-term disability? And that is used in the paper in a very specific way because this is a benefit that the employer offers. So it's paid leave for someone who goes on a medically related work absence. Benefits can be paid up to 6 months, but they're available actually on the very first day of a hospitalization, outpatient surgery, or injury. They're available after 7 days if you have an illness. This strikes me that this is a very broad definition of disability, if I understand correctly. And not to be too personal, but I thought about myself and my husband, and I think we would have both actually had episodes of short-term disability that I think at another firm you might actually just take a few days of sick leave to cover this health issue. And so I would encourage the authors, and maybe they're doing this, but to think about differentiating perhaps by the length of leave or the medical reason for leave, so that we can differentiate between things that really just represent a couple of days off for a health issue with no long-term implications versus a more significant episode of disability that may trigger other things down the road that we're interested in. And what about long-term disability? As was mentioned, the firm does offer this benefit as well once you exhaust your short-term disability benefits. Interestingly, you need to apply for SSDI to be eligible for the firm's long-term disability benefit. And at least in the version of the paper that I was looking at, the authors were dropping the 700 individuals who enter long-term disability. So that was disappointing. I'm actually happy to hear now that they are looking into those people, because I think they're particularly interesting. I think among sort of two people who both experience short-term disability, we're very interested in understanding why one ends ends up going into long-term disability and applying for SSDI and another one doesn't. So I hope that part of the long-term goal here is to include those in the trajectories and to try to understand what characteristics are associated with ending up in long-term disability. Another thing I was thinking about as I was reading this paper is employer accommodations on the job to a health problem and to what extent that could affect the trajectory. So to just sort of step back and give a bit of a policy framing for this, there are people who've suggested that we might want to consider introducing some experience rating into the employer part of the DI part of the payroll tax. And just to give at least my understanding of why some people might be thinking in terms of this, if you think about somebody who experiences a disabling event and then needs to decide, am I going to try to stick this out at work? Am I going to apply for SSDI benefits? Applying for DI benefits obviously requires leaving work to satisfy the 5-month waiting period requirement. Then the application itself takes some time to process, and you either end up getting onto the program or you don't. But if you don't get on the program, now you've severed the relationship with the employer. Your skills may have atrophied. You look less employable in a number of dimensions, and it's just not a very good position to be in. So some people have argued, and I'm not making any policy recommendations, but some people have said that what we may want to do is have a system that puts more emphasis on trying to accommodate the worker's disability at the moment of disability, and the experience rating is an idea to get some skin in the game on the employer side to encourage them to think in that way. Okay, so as I said, not a policy recommendation, but if you now bring that framing to this paper, to what extent is it useful to think of which trajectory the employee goes down as potentially endogenous to the availability of accommodations on the job? So I know that the authors are going to be looking at how job characteristics affect the choice of trajectory. They're already beginning to do this work, and I would encourage them to kind of continue down this path and maybe think about whether there's anything in their data set that actually can be considered a measure of the employer's ability to accommodate disability. They may be able to see if people switch to a part-time status or a job with different responsibilities. Of course, anything that reflects your actual decision is sort of an endogenous thing. So I'd be more interested, it would be ideal if, say, workers in location A versus location B had more availability, had more opportunity to make those kinds of changes, and then you could sort of compare that. So anyways, I just hope that they might think about that. My last suggestion is just really to think about what they will be able to do here in terms of the causality. They point out in the introduction that a lot of the research in this area doesn't necessarily untangle where the causal relationships are between employment, health, and disability. And in their own discussion of their results, they are appropriately cautious in drawing causal conclusions, which I really appreciate people being, sort of appropriate in terms of thinking about what they can and can't say from their work. But that did get me thinking, what will they be able to do as they continue to push this forward in terms of the causality? I think the first thing to do is just to specify what are the causal pathways that we would like to estimate ideally. And perhaps the two we might be most interested in are understanding first how health or changes in effect health or changes in health affect having these short-term periods of disability, and then also the relationship between disability and subsequent employment outcomes. So what will they be able to do here? Well, I think the longitudinal data here is very helpful because we're able to really look with this rich health claims data at what's going on with health prior to the episode of short-term disability. And it may be difficult with the thousands of people and the tens of millions of person-month observations, but to sort of collapse this in a way that's that you can kind of work with it. But how long before these episodes of short-term disability do the health changes show up? What kinds of health changes are predictive of having an episode of short-term disability? I'm very interested in this. Another strategy that some other authors have used successfully, I think, is to focus on things that are health shocks. So in some of my own work of long ago, which actually I think Deborah discussed at this conference like 13 years ago, scary, we've defined health shocks to be things like a first heart attack, stroke, new cancer diagnosis, things like this that you can't necessarily predict, but then they do represent a sort of demonstrable and sudden change to your health. So it might be useful to focus on things like that and look at when someone experiences a health shock, then how does that translate into disability and employment effects? And here I'll just say that I'm excited about their future plans to link this access to the Social Security earnings data. They have information on promotion, and I definitely encourage those efforts to understand when people separate from Alcoa, to what extent is that a retirement, because we're very interested in whether these are early retirements versus just sort of people leaving at the normal course of their life. So basically, out of time, I'll just say that I think these intersections between work, disability, and health are interesting and deserving of further study, especially when we widen the frame to go below, way before just the moment of exit and kind of look over the whole career. This paper is really well positioned to provide insights in that topic, and I'm looking forward to see what the authors can do with this very rich data set that they have. So thanks so much.
Thank you.